It's the Tronsmart Element Force. I did recently review the Bogasing M4, the really handily named Bogasing M4. And there were a few speakers you were pointing out, well, it looks like that, then it looks like that. You can look like something else, you could be very similar and not be exactly the same. A case in point, a lot of you said, isn't that a Tronsmart Element Force? And I went out, I had to look at the pictures. It did look a bit like it, to be honest. But do you know what? When you got them side by side, they're nothing like each other at all. Other than, yes, similar controls on the top, and yes, the back and the way they shaped the little flippy, outy, flappy thing. Where we do indeed have a micro SD slot, an auxiliary input, and USB-C on both of these speakers, but it's actually smaller. It's smaller. It doesn't have as rubberized a silicon casing on the Tronsmart as is on the Bogasing. I say that because they both describe themselves as having protective silicon casing, but this feels more like hard plastic with a little bit of silicon. Well, I'd be confident dropping that a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit. That certainly feels like it's better protected. Now, they weigh differently. My Bogasing weighs in 731 grams. The Tronsmart Element Force 743 grams. Surprisingly, looks a little bit smaller. It's actually the heavier. Now, in terms of the drivers, again, it's different. It's caught you out. A lot of you guys are saying, but I can see a shadow in the middle. That's got to be a passive radiator. No. So we've got a fake metal grille in the middle of the Bogasing M4 that's shaped to look like a passive radiator, but isn't. It's just a bit of metal with a large-ish passive radiator, a single passive radiator on the back, whereas we have a small passive radiator on the front there and a small passive radiator on the back there, making two passive radiators. Well, that makes it better. No, don't forget, whether you have 1 or 68 million passive radiators, they have to be sized to the drivers because it's working on air pressure, so it has to be balanced. So it's surface area that matters at the end of the day. And in terms of those drivers, 53 millimeters, they say, for the Element Force, 45 millimeters for the drivers on the Bogasing M4. Both are rated at 40 watts, so kind of looks like maybe the same guts inside. One thing I do want to mention is the pricing, because pricing is make or break. A decent speaker at $50, if it's suddenly the same speaker is $300 or £300, expecting something completely different. So I have described a good value, the Bogasing M4, based on Amazon.com. I can get that for $60. $60 a Bogasing M4, $55 Tronsmart Element Force. Basically the same price, and they work out about about 45, 50 pound in UK money. But if you go on Amazon.uk, they're asking crazy 68 quid, nearly 70 pound for the Bogasing, and 50 pounds for the Tronsmart Element Force. So that completely changes the comparison. So in America, yes, they are around that £50 mark where I'm saying, oh, it could be £50, $60 champion. But in the UK, we're into Motion Plus territory. It's a whole different ballgame at £70. You know, and it's not going to be such good value, especially when we're up against a speaker 70, then 50, £20 cheaper. Doesn't have to be quite as good to be the same value. But the big thing about the Tronsmart Element Force is, well, they called it Sound Pulse. What is Sound Pulse? Surely it's not going to be a marketing gimmick. It's going to be something fantastic and real. And when you read up, it says an upgraded version of DSP, digital audio processing, which works alongside a customized chip and large power chamber. With this combination of advanced engineering and sophisticated software, Tronsmart Sound Pulse technology has reached far beyond the industry standard, creating a new generation of powerful and portable Bluetooth speakers. So there you go. Actually, yes, it is marketing nonsense. It's a bit of DSP. That's what it is. Now, they both have what they call tri-EQ. So again, you think, oh, they must be the same because they both have a 3D mode and they both have two other modes, and they both have an LED that changes color depending on what mode you're in. Again, on the Bogasing. However, let's have a look at the modes and the frequency response for the Tronsmart Element Force. Default mode, which is what they call extra bass mode, and that's with no LEDs on. It's on the rise the whole way, basically. from bass all the way up to around 5.5 kilohertz, where we then get this dip. The same dip actually we get in the Bogasing M4, and then on a rise again to a big peak around the 12 kilohertz mark. So that's a bright signature. And what worries me here is the whole of the bass, even the upper bass, is below the mids, is below everything. And what concerns me here, it looks a bit bass-light, because even at 40% where we'd like a lot of bass adjustment, so it still sounds full to our ears, even the upper bass is only just in line with the mids. And as we go up the volume step, falls away even more. And so this looks like a very bright signature, quite bass-light, in so-called extra bass mode. 3D mode with the blue LED on, well, it's quieter, you can see that, but overall, the actual sound signature looks pretty much the same. And with the white LED on, it's what they call standard mode, and that is even quieter than the other two modes, and yet the sound signature looks almost identical to the extra bass mode. So overall, other than the difference in volumes, the sound signatures on each EQ mode look basically the same, but 3D mode may shine when it comes to real-time processing on a real track. So frequency response for all three of them looks a bit weird because they look pretty similar. I will say that the good thing on the Tronsmart that you don't get on the Bogasing is when you set an EQ you like and then you turn the speaker off, when it comes back on, it will be in that EQ mode. That isn't the case with the Bogasing. I like super bass mode, which is not default mode, but when I turn it on after playing it again, it goes back to default mode. That's a hassle, and that's quite good, and it's a bit different between these two speakers on the Tronsmart Element Force. But what do those modes actually sound like? They look pretty similar, apart from the volume level. In a frequency response, what did they actually sound like?
Get drunk and you call it. I'm right where you want me. You know what to say. Yeah. 1 minute I'm flying, the next I'm crying. Yeah, I still wanna stay. Yeah, you got so many secrets, but who will I keep them? You're not mine anymore. Oh no, but if your heart is open, I'll be the first to close it. Why do I answer your call? I'm upset.
So actually, once you have loudness, normalize them. Once you've got the volumes equal, there is not a lot of difference between them. However, I will say 3D does have more processing going on. You may or may not like it. It does make it sound a bit more airy, but it also makes it sound a bit more weird. It's a sort of tuning or the sort of processing where it sounds good for a few minutes and then becomes quite tiresome. It even has a tad more deep bass than the default, what they call extra bass mode, but has less upper bass, and so overall has less bass than default mode. Standard mode is a very quiet mode. It's basically, to me, default mode, but quieter. So from now on, I'm going to, for my testing, apart from maximum volume, I'm going to be using the default mode, where you don't have any LED lights on at all, and they're calling that extra bass mode. So we want to hear what it sounds like. These two speakers compared at about 50% lowish moderate volumes.
I am burning buck smoke bands. Always been the MO since the start of this, and now I'm on a mission like I'm Artemis. Hey, we gon' turn the crib into a club like Hennessy and Buddha screaming thug life. Get it, baby, you know I'm the plug, right? But got a feeling that it's gonna be a long night. Yeah, never an average night. 2-4 hours up in the day, I gotta make it right. 18 of those, I'm in the cave, I gotta make some light, make it hype. Even if we break a night, and even if things go left, we gotta make them right. Chillin' with mom, we triple up, they on the double up, triple dub. Came from the basement, we only going up. They loving us. Up in the booth, I'm getting dizzy, but they the cup is up. Toast to my people that's wanna come up and you live with us. Ain't all about the trigger bus. Looking at my watch, your spirit bomb, both hands is going up. You going coast to coast with us. See the flows is flowing, overflowing, yeah, the cup it runneth over. Tidal wave up in the ocean. We gon' turn the crib into a club like Hennessy and Buddha screaming thug life. Get it, baby, you know I'm the plug, right? But you got a feeling that it's gonna be a long night.
So may look similar, may have a lot of similar things going on, but sound very different when you come to listen to them. And the thing that strikes me between these two speakers is where the Bogasing M4 excels, and that's, I think, for a speaker of that size and that price, it's in the bass. That's where the Tronsmart Element Force is at its weakest. So this is a kind of thin, but clear sounding, lots of clarity. The vocals can sound pretty nice, but the bass is not good. The quality is not great. It's thin and it's tinny. And so when you hear an A-B, the difference between them is huge. Nice bass, but that sounds clearer. You're kind of thinking, oh, if only they could have had the two things together. But for my money, the Bogasing, don't forget, actually already has a heavy lift in the high end. It's quite V-shaped with an extra lift in its default mode at the high end. So bear that in mind, that in the real world, that's very thin. And that's why it's very clear sounding speaker of the Tronsmart Element Force. Overall, we're talking 3D more bass on the M4, which is like doubling the power. That's big. And then we're talking 10 decibels up just at 50 hertz, which is, you know, starting proper deep bass territory. So let's push it to, you know, decent volume, 75%. So this is where I now switch on extra bass mode. Well, super bass mode, they call that on the Bogasing M4.
Everybody on your feet, pour another shot with me. Everybody on your feet, pour another shot with me. Versace on my wrist, baby, make a wish. You could sell your Rari, but you can't afford my outfit. Versace on my wrist, baby, make a wish. You could sell your Rari, but you can't afford my outfit. Versace on my wrist, baby, make a wish. You could sell your Rari, but you can't afford my outfit. Versace on my wrist, baby, make a wish. You could sell your Rari, but you can't afford my outfit. Pop another bottle of that Hennessy. Out here on the rooftop like a fantasy. Pop another bottle of that Hennessy. Out here on the rooftop like a fantasy. Everybody on your feet, pour another shot with me. Everybody on your feet, pour another shot with me. Everybody on your feet, pour another shot with me. Everybody on your feet, pour another shot with me.
It's kind of the same story, but even more so, because when I switch to super bass mode on the M4, it's more balanced, and it's a decent listen, and it's a very safe listen, because although there is a bit of a push at the high end on the M4 in super bass mode, it's never over the edge. So it's quite, you could describe that as quite smooth sounding. So it's going to sound safe, but with a decent old bass. I just think in America at $60 for the size and for the price, that's a decent old sound in super bass mode. Now the Tronsmart, I can see why you may or may not, why you would like it. It sounds very clear, pretty reasonable with vocals, but it is bass light. It does sound tinny to my ears. I wouldn't have this even if it was my own. I talk about sometimes if you only have one speaker, they're all going to sound good. I wouldn't find that a satisfying listen anyway. It is too bright. There isn't enough bass. The balance is completely off. But you know, if you hate bass and then it doesn't matter to you, then or you're just listening to podcasts and stuff, that is probably a fine speaker. Certainly has a lot of decent reviews on Amazon. But for my money, I would only listen to the M4 of these two speakers. This would not be a keeper, even if it was my only speaker, to be quite honest, on the Tronsmart Element Force. So, how loud do they go? 100% volume.
Like fading pictures, you are falling out of frame. We have only old memories, but I love you just the same. Same, 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 I love you just the same. I love you just the same. It never would have worked, we collide like shooting stars. Never seeing eye to eye, but you'll always be in my heart. Like fading pictures, you are falling out of frame. We have only old memories, but I love you just the same.
So the loudest is the Tronsmart Element Force in its default mode, extra bass mode, just a fraction ahead of the M4 in its default mode, which is what they call 3D mode. In terms of peak, about a decibel up, but it goes louder because that's pushing the mids, as you can see. There's a big difference, mids forward on the Tronsmart, mids recessed on the M4, and overall, in terms of that bass, it's still very bass light on the Element Force, 2 decibels down in total bass on the M4, but a brighter sound signature helping it to go louder. The M4 in its default mode, the highs are not the greatest, so you do get more volume, but it can sound a bit weird. Then the Element Force in so-called 3D mode, it does kind of make it a bit more airy sounding, but it also can sound a bit weird. But it's significantly louder than the M4 in its super bass mode, which for me is the best mode of all these speakers. It's a decibel up in peak, but in LUFS it's 3 decibels louder, and it's 3 decibels louder because it's much, much brighter. That is the overall sound signature of the Element Force, but the super bass mode still holds sway in overall bass at 1 decibel greater, and so overall it would have a smoother sound signature, probably the most listenable but not very loud of all the sound signatures and maximum volume. So ultimately, yeah, the Tronsmart does go the loudest. That shouldn't be a surprise because it's pushing less bass. Pushing less bass, it can push the mids and the highs more, so it can go louder. But the difference is not huge. And of course, in its default mode, it does go the loudest, but it sounds a bit weird on the Bogasing. Well, it sounds very weird actually. The high end is not nice. That's why super bass mode is my preferred mode until you need a lot of extra volume. And at lower volume, okay, then the default mode kind of works. That V-shape does give you a bit of dynamics and some clarity. So you get the clarity on the Tronsmart at maximum volume. But again, bass is tinny. It's not a great listen. And then we come down to the other two modes. The 3D mode, which is okay, but it can sound weird. As again, I said, it's a 5-minute tuning. It sounds quite nice. Oh, that's a bit different, but it's nothing to do with the original track, and it's quite weird. process. You're just going to hear the processing in a long listen. And then we've got super bass mode, which is the quietest by a long way. To me, it's artificially limited. There's no reason why it should be that quiet other than the just limiting distortion, which is fair enough. But hey ho, a little bit more volume on that super bass mode could have been a winner. But still, probably the best listen is super bass mode. So in all volumes except for maximum volume, it's a clear winner for me, the Bogasing. Okay, ultimately you can go a bit louder on the Tronsmart, and the highs are not as weird as the default mode on the M4, where it does sound weird if you want the volume. So if you are playing maximum volumes, maybe the Tronsmart of the two speakers would be a winner. But for my money, I'd rather have the Bogasing. But not at 70 quid. Yes, in the UK, 70 quid versus 50 quid, a £20 difference. Well, that's a whole different ball game. Other specs that I haven't mentioned, we're talking, you know, they seem to have similar guts. Probably got the same processing, I would imagine. They have the same battery, 24.4 watt hours, which is a decent sized battery. Obviously SBC, codecs, Bluetooth 5, both do stereo pairing, both have USB-C connections, both have an auxiliary input, both can be used as a phone speaker, and both have that micro SD card slot. You can play your music straight off the card. Both are 40 watt rated speakers, but how they're measuring that's another thing. It doesn't say RMS, so whatever. We know at the end of the day, they go about as loud as each other, albeit they sound very different. What I do like about both these speakers, both IPX7 rated, they both float and can be played with the drivers up. That's rare, and that's nice to have. Both pretty poor, in my experience, on my Android device. 150 milliseconds a pair, again, seems to suggest most of the innards are the same, but the DSP is the real difference here. Whether those drivers are actually the same drivers, and just the measurements are a bit different. I've got them down as 45 millimeters, 53 millimeters, but hey ho, could, depending on how they measured them, could actually be the same drivers. But 150 milliseconds, not usable. That's my cutoff is 80 milliseconds, but hey ho, your experience may be different. It's very device specific. The latency you're going to experience when you are streaming. So there you go. You said they look the same. Are they the same? No, they're not the same. They sound completely different. They are different sizes, but there are similarities. I would imagine the processing inside is the same, but the tuning is different. But again, two small passive radiators, one big passive radiator. That's the difference as well. Hope you're staying out of this review, and thank you for watching.
I ain't about that life. I ain't about that life. Ain't no project wife, got my logic right, guess I'm not your type. I ain't about that life. I ain't about that life. Sorry, ma, I ain't get it right. I'ma just live my life. I ain't about that. I ain't about that life.